The cake didn't fall by accident. Tommy's hands were small, but his intent was steady, the way a boy presses a doorbell and waits for the trouble it summons. Chocolate layers slid off the platter, raspberry filling burst like a dark firework, and 34 unlit candles scattered across my new hardwood in a bright little stampede. No one moved. You could hear the hum of my refrigerator and the soft hiss of the HVAC pushing afternoon air through vents that suddenly sounded too loud in my own home. "Eat it off the ground, Aunt Dedra," he said, and the room held its breath. Jackson lifted one corner of his mouth without showing teeth. Vanessa raised her phone, then lowered it, calculating whether this moment helped her feed or starve an audience. My mother's hand went to her throat in stage surprise. My father checked his watch like a man waiting out a light. I stood with the knife still in my hand and a paper crown crooked on my head, feeling the elastic bite into my hairline, while the cake bled down the floorboards toward the white baseboards I'd painted last month. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever stood in your own house and felt like a stranger at your own party, tap that like button and share this with someone who will understand. Make sure you're subscribed so you won't miss what comes next. But to understand why a cake on the floor could open a fault line through a family, you need to know the ground that cracked. I grew up in a small ranch house with an oak kitchen table that collected 4 lifetimes of coffee rings. When Dad got laid off my sophomore year, we lived on Mom's nursing shifts and whatever hours I could grab bagging groceries and pushing carts through the slush in winter. I learned early that bills don't care about feelings and late fees don't listen to excuses. The first paycheck I ever held never made it to the jar where I'd been saving for an old Honda. Mom sat at that oak table with a stack of pink envelopes, and I slid the money across the wood without thinking. Relief softened her shoulders, and something warm and dangerous settled in me, the belief that I could fix it. Jackson learned something too. He learned that if he groaned loud enough about homework and laughed hard enough at the right moments, gravity would tilt his way. He's still finding himself. Mom would say, as if he were buried treasure. "You've always been the responsible one," Dad would add. Like responsibility was something poured into me at the factory and not built one tired choice at a time. We didn't call it favoritism. Families rarely do. We called it understanding, and then we arranged our lives around it. By the time I graduated from architecture school, the pattern had a rhythm like a ceiling fan. You stop hearing until it squeaks. Jackson needed tuition, then a party, then a reliable car for a job that never seemed to cover the life he advertised. I co-signed. I covered. I smiled. When he met Vanessa, I paid for an engagement ring I never saw, and later I added my signature to a mortgage that felt like a promise I wasn't asked to make. I told myself I was investing in peace. Some investments never pay. The house I bought last fall was the first thing that felt like mine from the studs out. Mid-century lines. Sun that crossed the living room like a slow prayer every afternoon. I painted the baseboards myself, turned a spare room into a quiet office, and saved a second bedroom for visiting family because I still believed in the version of us where people show up with gratitude and take off their shoes. The morning of my birthday, I woke before the sun and baked a chocolate cake the way my grandmother taught me. The kitchen smelled like vanilla and hope. I set the layers to cool, let raspberry jam kiss the middle smoothed frosting until it shone, and placed a ring of berries that looked like a crown made for a small kingdom. When I stepped back, I felt proud in a way that had nothing to do with awards or invoices. I wanted to feed the people I loved and be fed in return. They were supposed to arrive at noon. 1 o'clock came with a curt call. "We're running behind," and 1:30 brought all of them at once like a weather front. Dad set a small gift bag by the couch and cleared his throat. Mom scanned my open floor plan the way a nurse reads vitals. "These windows will be a beast to clean," she said, not unkindly, but not kind. Jackson asked for the good liquor Vanessa toured with her phone held waist-high, narrating softly. Tommy ran for my glass shelves, and the model of my award-winning community center jumped once and shattered. "Oops," he said, and headed for the stairs. Jackson didn't bend to pick up a single piece. "Kids will be kids," he offered, as if the sentence were a broom. A set of small cruelties followed like geese across a winter pond. Vanessa called my furniture minimal in a cold way, and then smiled like she'd given me a gift. My parents sat safely on the sofa, while a conversation about my new library project drowned under fantasy football scores. When Tommy complained he was bored, I handed him a new handheld game I'd researched and bought with the same care I give a client. He glanced at the box and said, "Joey has the limited edition," and let it slide into the cushions. "You can love people and still notice how they look at you." My mother looked around my house and saw maintenance, not accomplishment. My father watched the clock. Vanessa saw content. Jackson saw convenience. Tommy saw a stage. I went to the kitchen, lifted the cake from the refrigerator, and told myself that sugar can pull a room back from the edge. In the microwave door, my paper crown looked silly, and I kept it on anyway, because silly can be sacred when the day has been unkind. I set the cake on the table and stood straighter than I felt. "Before we cut," I said, "there's a little news." I told them my firm was a finalist for a major prize in sustainable design. Dad nodded like I'd reported tomorrow's weather. Mom said, "That's nice, dear," and smoothed an invisible wrinkle on the table runner. Jackson scrolled. Vanessa adjusted her lipstick. Tommy's chair scraped the floor, a sound like a match across sandpaper. He came around the table, eyes narrowed a smirk that did not belong on a child. The platter slid under his little push, a slow-motion surrender. The cake left the edge and turned midair like a soft planet losing its orbit. It landed frosting first, a quiet splat that felt louder than a slammed door. Raspberry bled toward my baseboards again like a red line finding the same scar. 34 candles rolled into corners and under chairs. I didn't say a word. My silence filled the room until Vanessa finally put a hand to her chest and said, "What a mess, like weather had done this." Tommy pointed and said his line. Jackson put a palm on his son's shoulder and laughed without apology. My mother went for paper towels. My father said the game started at 6. No one asked for a broom. No one said, "I'm sorry." I bent anyway, because someone had to. When the first wedge of ruined cake sagged into the dustpan, Jackson decided it had been an accident and that my face was the problem. "You don't have kids, so you wouldn't understand." I stood up slowly and set the broom against the table. "Kids do what they're allowed to do," I said, and the truth of it emptied the color from Vanessa's cheeks. The room tightened. Jackson told Tommy to grab his things. Vanessa sang a soft reprimand about not playing with food, then looked at my waist and added, "Probably saved you a few calories." My parents gathered their coats like the house had gotten cold. They left in a staggered line, offering soft parting noises that pretended closeness. At the door, I heard my mother whisper to Jackson, "She's always been too sensitive a diagnosis that costs nothing and fixes less." The porch light caught their faces for a second and then released them to the driveway. The engine noise faded down my street. The quiet that came after wasn't peace. It was the echo of a church after everyone goes home. I cleaned like it was a job. Raspberry seeds flicked against the towel and chocolate smeared into low-tide brown. I popped one candle from under a chair with my toe and lined it with the others along the counter, a neat little row of wishes that hadn't made it to fire. The crown sat on the table where I'd taken it off, and in the late light, my new windows threw long rectangles across the floor I'd mopped that morning. I threw the last of the cake into the trash and stared at the small crater it left in the bag, an absence shaped like celebration. At 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed on the coffee table with a sound that could pass for urgency if you're lonely. I turned the screen over in my hand, expecting a single clear apology that would be too little and late and still tempting. The family group chat was waiting with something else. After discussing today's events, We've chosen to sever all contact. Your negativity and judgment are harmful to Tommy. Stay away forever." Jackson had liked it. The sentence sat there like a signed form. Old habits rise like steam. I almost typed a paragraph that would educate and convince the way I've emailed contractors who try to cut corners on structural steel. Instead, I put the phone face down and let my eyes blur until the room softened. When the tears ran out, the quiet deepened, and I could hear the tick inside the thermostat on the hallway wall. I poured a glass of wine and didn't drink it. I opened the refrigerator for something cold and closed it on the same loneliness. I sat under my criticized windows and let the house hold me the way a good chair holds a tired back without asking questions. Somewhere, a dog barked 2 streets over. Somewhere, a television cheered for a game my father wanted to make. Here in this one house, a woman breathed in and out and admitted a private truth she'd never dared name. The love she kept pouring had been used like a faucet left running in a room no one bothered to enter. I picked up the phone again and scrolled the text like a nurse reading an EKG she already knows by heart. The words didn't change. A different relief came, then cool and clear like air when a storm finally breaks. I opened my notes app and wrote a sentence that sounded like a blueprint more than a threat. The letters looked neat and strange in my own font. I didn't send anything. Not yet. I just watched the cursor blink at the edge of the last word and realized that the line it made was not a wall. It was a doorway. In the kitchen, the trash can lid settled with a soft click. Down the street, a car turned the corner and washed my living room in brief headlights. I turned my phone face down again and listened to the house breathe. The refrigerator hummed. The vents whispered. The crown on the table cast a small shadow that looked almost like a halo, tilted and stubborn. Outside, the porch light burned over an empty step, steady and patient. Inside, in the quiet between one heartbeat and the next, something in me stepped back from the edge of begging and faced the long, clean hallway ahead. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking sound inside the hallway thermostat. The porch light still burned through the front windows, casting a warm square of gold on the hardwood floor where the cake had fallen hours before. I hadn't turned it off. Maybe I needed it there, proof that something kind still glowed in the dark, even if it was just a bulb doing its job. I sat on the sofa legs, tucked beneath a blanket, staring at the text that had ended 20 years of giving. My family's message was still open on the screen. Stay away forever. Jackson's name sat underneath with a tiny heart icon beside it, as if cruelty could be softened by a digital gesture. I wanted to believe it was a joke or a burst of anger that would fade by morning. But my hands were steady. My body knew this was the end, even if my mind hadn't caught up yet. The night slipped forward in pieces. I drank half a glass of wine, then let it warm and settle untouched on the table. I thought about my parents' house, the creak of the floor outside my old room, the smell of coffee in the morning, the sound of my mother humming while she folded laundry. Somehow, those memories belonged to people I didn't recognize anymore. Around midnight, I fell asleep where I sat, still wrapped in the blanket, my phone face down beside me. When I woke, the light was gray and thin. A bird tapped the window before flying off. My head throbbed from too little sleep, and the air felt heavier than before, as though the house itself was mourning. I went through the motions, coffee shower hair pulled into a low bun, but every task echoed inside the silence they had left behind. Even the sound of the spoon clinking against the mug felt too loud. By mid-morning, I couldn't sit anymore. I picked up my phone and called the only person I could trust to answer without judgment. Elena answered on the second ring, her voice still groggy but warm. "Dedra." "What's wrong?" The words came out uneven, half whisper, half breath. They cut me off, I said. All of them. I told her about the cake, the text, the years of money and favors, the hollow birthday that had become a battlefield. There were pauses where I couldn't find the next word, and Elena filled them with quiet, steady breathing that told me she was still there. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then she said, "They did what I could hear her get out of bed, the rustle of covers, the click of a lamp. They told you to stay away forever, after you paid for everything they have, Dedra. That's not family. That's extortion with manners." Her outrage was sharp, but underneath it was care. It broke something loose in me. "I told them I'd remove my name from their loans," I whispered. It was the only thing I could think to say. "That's the least you should do," she said firmly. "You've been paying for their comfort at the cost of your peace. It's not selfish to stop the bleeding." Her words echoed the ones my therapist had said months earlier, but hearing them now felt different. This time, I believed them. We talked for nearly an hour. By the end, she offered to come over, but I told her I needed a little time alone to think. "Promise me you'll call if you start doubting yourself," she said. I promised. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and pen. The sun had climbed higher, tracing soft light across the counter where the cake once rested. I drew a line down the center of the page and titled one side, "What I Gave," and the other, "What I Lost." The lists grew faster than I expected. Tuition, car loan, mortgage, holidays, weekends, birthdays. Then on the other side, time, sleep, joy, respect. By the time I finished, the columns felt like a mirror of my life. One side neat and generous, the other quiet and empty. I knew what I had to do. I called Brian, my financial advisor, a calm man with a patient voice who had seen more than a few family entanglements unravel. "I need to remove myself from some loans," I said. "It's urgent." He didn't ask for details, only scheduled an appointment that afternoon and told me what documents to bring. After that, I called Tara, a law school friend who specialized in family law. Her tone was practical, grounded. "You're not being cruel," she told me over coffee later that day. "You're protecting yourself from financial abuse." That's exactly what this is. That word settled in me like a cold truth. Abuse. I'd never put a name to it before, but it explained the exhaustion that had followed me for years. It wasn't generosity that drained me. It was captivity disguised as duty. By evening, my dining table had transformed into a battlefield of paperwork, contracts, statements, loan documents, and folded letters from banks I'd ignored for years. I worked until the streetlights came on, creating piles labeled joint co-signed and unpaid. When I finally stepped back, I realized the total. $130,000 tied to people who couldn't even wish me a happy birthday. I sat there staring at the numbers until the digits blurred. The next morning, I drove downtown to meet Brian. The city moved around me in its usual rhythm. Cars merging, people rushing to work, but it all looked strangely new, like I'd been living behind glass and only now stepped out. In the bank's marble lobby, I waited with a folder clutched to my chest. Brian met me with his gentle professionalism, guiding me through each form. "This might take a few months," he said, sliding the final document toward me. "But once it's processed, you'll be free of legal responsibility." Free. The word carried more weight than any number on the page. As I signed the final line, my hand trembled just slightly, but it wasn't fear. It was release. He gave me a small, encouraging smile. "You've done something people take years to find the courage for." I thanked him and walked outside into the crisp air. The clouds were breaking apart above the buildings, and sunlight spilled through in uneven stripes. For the first time in a long time, I felt lighter. that feeling didn't last long. By the time I reached my car, my phone was vibrating nonstop. Dozens of missed calls, unread messages, and emails from Jackson, Vanessa, and my parents. The subject lines shifted like weather, anger, guilt, then panic. I didn't open any of them. But as I drove home, the noise of the notifications filled the quiet like a swarm of flies I couldn't escape. When I stepped into the house, I set the phone face down on the counter and went to wash my hands. The scent of soap grounded me sharp and clean. Then I sat down and began sorting through the new messages one by one. Jackson's tone changed with each hour, first a threat, then guilt, then bargaining. Mom's words were softer, but somehow worse. "You've always been sensitive," she wrote. "Don't ruin the family over a misunderstanding." Dad's text was short. "Think carefully before you make things permanent." None of them mentioned the cake. That night, Elena came over with takeout and 2 bottles of wine. She didn't ask to be let in, she just arrived the way true friends do when they know silence can't be handled alone. We ate in the living room with the television muted. When she finished her meal, she showed me her phone. Vanessa had posted photos online, tears, a caption about betrayal, and hashtags that turned my private life into an exhibit. "They're trying to control the story," Elena said. "Don't let them. I promised I wouldn't." Still, the sight of those images stirred something deep and raw. It wasn't embarrassment. It was mourning the death of the version of my family I had kept believing in. Later that night, the doorbell rang. I peeked through the window and saw Jackson's car idling in the driveway. The headlights washed across my porch, too bright, too demanding. He rang again, shouting my name, but I stayed still behind the curtain. The third ring turned into pounding. Then, finally, silence. When I looked again, his car was gone, leaving only the smell of exhaust drifting through the autumn air. The next morning brought a new message from Vanessa, soft and polished, pretending nothing had happened. "Tommy is devastated," she wrote. "He doesn't understand why his aunt doesn't want to see him. Can we talk for his sake?" The manipulation was so transparent it almost made me laugh. I forwarded the message to Tara without replying. Days passed like that, threats turning to guilt to pleading, and then to rumors. My parents began calling my colleagues, telling them I was having a breakdown, hoping someone would convince me to come back to reason. When my therapist called after receiving one of those concerned messages, I sat in her office and cried harder than I had since that birthday. She listened quietly, then said something that stayed with me. "When you stop feeding a dysfunctional system, it will call you crazy. Don't mistake the noise for truth." After that session, I knew there was no turning back. The bridge had already burned. I just hadn't realized I was standing on the other side. A week later, a formal letter arrived from Tara confirming the process was in motion. Jackson and Vanessa's finances were unraveling quickly, car repossessions, late notices, and rumors spreading through their neighborhood. I felt a strange mix of guilt and relief. Guilt because Tommy didn't choose his parents' mistakes. Relief because I finally wasn't paying for them. That evening, I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window. Outside, the trees bent in the wind, their branches tapping the glass like polite reminders of change. The silence in the house was different now. It wasn't the silence of being ignored. It was the silence of boundaries holding steady. The kind of quiet that waits for something new to begin. I thought about the list I'd written, the 2 columns, what I gave and what I lost. I reached for the notepad on the counter and added a 3rd column, what I've found. Under it, I wrote a single word: freedom. The letters looked uneven in my handwriting, but the meaning felt sure. I set the pen down and leaned back against the chair, watching the last streak of light fade across the yard. Somewhere inside, the ache was still there, but softer now, like a bruise healing beneath the skin. Tomorrow would bring more messages, more noise, maybe even more fallout. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the quiet. I closed my eyes, listening to the hum of the house, the hum of my own life returning. The morning light spread across the kitchen like a soft apology, touching the edges of the counter where I'd left last night's coffee mug. I stood by the sink with the window open, breathing in the quiet. Outside, a sparrow hopped along the fence, pecking at the last of the frost. It was strange how the world kept its rhythm, no matter how much yours had changed. The first few days after the separation were filled with a kind of careful silence. I worked long hours at the office, coming home to a house that no longer echoed with tension. It should have felt empty, but instead, it felt alive. The air moved differently, lighter, like it had been waiting for me to make space. Still, the messages didn't stop. Even after the bank started processing the loan removals, my phone pulsed with notifications. Jackson had found new angles for guilt. Vanessa posted poetic captions about betrayal. My parents sent short, clipped texts that sounded rehearsed. I learned to mute them all. I stopped explaining, stopped defending. The freedom in that small act felt almost physical, like exhaling after years of holding my breath. A week later, Tara called. Her voice was calm, but carried a weight I recognized from her long days in court. "Your brother tried contacting me again," she said. "When I reminded him, 'I represent you,' he became hostile. I documented everything." I thanked her, though the words felt small. After we hung up, I stood at the window watching the clouds pass over the neighborhood. There was a calmness in knowing the line had been drawn, yet I couldn't shake the ache underneath it. For so long, I'd believed being the good daughter meant absorbing everyone else's storms. Now that the wind had quieted, I was left alone with my own. That evening, I met Elena at a small Italian cafe downtown. We took a corner table near the window where rain streaked the glass. She looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "You look different," she said finally. "Lighter, but tired." "I feel both," I admitted. She smiled gently. "That's what healing looks like at first." We talked about everything but the family workbooks, the new art exhibit she wanted to see. I hadn't realized how much space those conversations had been taking up in my life, filling every pause, every breath. When the check came, I reached for it out of habit, but she stopped me. "Let someone else treat you for once," she said. It was a small kindness, but it hit something deep inside me. Later that night, when I got home, I sat at my desk, surrounded by blueprints. The lamp cast a warm pool of light across the paper, and I traced the clean lines of a new project with my fingertip. My thoughts drifted to Tommy. I wondered what story he'd been told about me, what version of me existed in his young mind now. The thought hurt in a quiet, distant way. I didn't hate him. I pitied the world being built around him. Days turned into weeks. The tension from my family's side began to take shape in the outside world. Jackson's cars were repossessed. Vanessa's posts grew vague, filled with quotes about storms and strength. My parents sold their house, moving to Arizona. None of them reached out directly, though my cousin Rachel sent a message now and then, updates without judgment, a fragile thread connecting two corners of the same story. At work, my focus sharpened. Projects I'd postponed came alive again. I redesigned a downtown library, a space built around light and stillness. My clients noticed the change before I did. "You seem settled," one said during a meeting. I smiled, but didn't explain. How could I tell him that losing everything familiar had steadied me? One afternoon, I walked into Brian's office to review the last set of documents. The process was nearly complete. He handed me a folder and leaned back in his chair. Once this is finalized, your financial ties to them will be gone. I nodded, running my fingers over the edge of the paper. It feels like signing a divorce, I said quietly. In a way, it is, he replied. The end of one kind of relationship so another can start, the one you have with yourself. His words followed me all the way home. When I unlocked my front door, the late sun spilled across the entryway, catching on the picture frames along the hall. Friends, co-workers, places I'd built with my own hands. The house no longer looked like a fortress. It looked like a reflection. That night, I opened a bottle of wine and went through my old files. I deleted family group photos from my phone, but I kept one Tommy sitting on my shoulders at a fair years ago, his face covered in cotton candy. I printed it and pinned it to my refrigerator, not as a wound, but as a reminder of what was once innocent. A few days later, I saw Vanessa's car pass by my office. She didn't come in, but I saw her face through the tinted glass, pale, drawn, no trace of her usual performance. For a moment, I wondered if she'd pull over if she'd try to talk. She didn't. She drove on, leaving behind the faint echo of what-ifs. That night, my father's handwriting appeared in my mailbox. A letter, neatly folded, no return address. I stood by the porch light as I opened it. His tone was careful, almost businesslike. They were selling the house, moving west for Mom's health. We don't blame you for the decisions you've made, he wrote. Take care of yourself. I read the letter twice. There was no apology, but there was something else, acceptance maybe, or the start of it. I tucked it into a drawer and let the weight of it settle somewhere I couldn't quite name. The following weekend, I joined Elena for a hike along the river. The air was crisp, the water low and steady. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. She stopped halfway up the trail and looked at me. You know you don't owe anyone your peace, she said. Not even the people who gave you your last name. I smiled at that, not because it was new, but because it finally sounded true. That night, after she dropped me off, I sat outside on the back patio with a blanket around my shoulders. The stars were faint against the city glow, but one or two were stubborn enough to shine through. I thought about how for years I had built my life like scaffolding around everyone else's needs. Now, piece by piece, I was taking it down. Beneath it, something steadier was emerging. Not happiness yet, but stillness. Inside my phone vibrated once a single message from an unknown number. It was short. Just 2 words. We're sorry. I stared at it for a long time. There was no name, but I knew whose apology it wasn't. It wasn't Jackson's. It wasn't my parents'. The image of Tommy came to mind, 8 years old, finally old enough to hold a phone. Maybe he'd found a way to reach out. Maybe not. Either way, I didn't reply. I wanted him to keep that small act of courage unbroken by the noise of adults. As the night deepened, I closed my eyes and listened to the hum of the street beyond the fence. It sounded like life continuing, soft, ordinary, unstoppable. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle cut through the dark, a low note fading into silence. I took a slow breath, the kind that fills you from the inside out. There were still traces of grief sharp in unexpected places, but they no longer ruled me. What replaced them wasn't triumph. It was something quieter, a sense that I had finally stopped trying to be understood by people who never wanted to see me clearly. Inside the house, the lamp by the sofa cast a faint circle of light on the wall. The same crown from my birthday still sat in a drawer, bent but unbroken. I thought of the night it slipped from my hair and hit the floor, and for the first time, the memory didn't sting. It just existed like an old scar you can touch without pain. I stayed outside until the wind grew cool, the kind of chill that reminds you it's time to go in. Tomorrow would bring more ordinary things, blueprints, meetings, deadlines. But tonight was something else. It was the first night in years that the silence didn't feel like loss. It felt like ownership. When I finally went back inside, I locked the door behind me, turned off the porch light, and let the darkness settle. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was home. A pale mist lingered over the street the next morning, softening the sharp lines of the houses. I stood on my porch with a cup of coffee and watched it drift through the maples like breath. The quiet felt different now, no longer fragile, no longer heavy. It was simply mine. At work, things moved faster than they ever had. My firm had just landed 2 major contracts, one of them a cultural center downtown. The project filled my days with meetings, drafts, and endless design adjustments. But for the first time in years, the noise felt purposeful. My focus wasn't splintered between deadlines and damage control. Every idea had space to breathe. My employees noticed the difference. So did I. Brian called to confirm the last of the loan removals. "You're clear," he said. "Every account is finalized. You're officially untangled." I thanked him and hung up, staring at my reflection in the office window. The skyline behind me glowed in the late sun, all glass and amber. I thought about the weight I'd carried for so long, the invisible burden of being everyone's solution. Letting it go didn't just change my balance sheet. It changed how I stood in the world. Elena invited me to dinner that weekend. She'd started making it a ritual, Saturday meals at her townhouse, music, low candles burning, no phones allowed. That evening, she made roasted chicken with lemon and rosemary, and we talked about nothing in particular. When she asked how I was really doing, I told her the truth. "I'm still sad," I said, "but it's the kind of sadness that doesn't hurt to touch anymore." She nodded, squeezing my hand. "That means it's healing." A few days later, a letter arrived from Arizona. The handwriting was my father's again, steadier this time. Inside a few short lines, "We've settled in. Your mother's breathing is better in the dry air. We hope you're well, if you're ever passing through the doors open." There was no mention of the past, no apology, but also no guilt. Just distance softened by civility. I placed the letter in the same drawer as the first one and closed it quietly. The weeks that followed were peaceful in a way that startled me. I'd wake early, walk through the neighborhood, and return to the smell of coffee and sunlight on the kitchen floor. The house no longer carried echoes of old tension. I filled the empty guest rooms. One became a yoga studio, the other a reading nook with the soft chair I'd always wanted. It felt like reclaiming square footage in my own life. Work flourished. I hired 3 new architects, young and eager, their desks bright with sticky notes and hope. One of them, Zoe, reminded me of myself at 24, brilliant, anxious, overextended. I'd often hear her on the phone, whispering about rent or helping her brother again. One afternoon, after a late meeting, I found her sitting alone in the break room staring at her bank app. I poured 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her. "You're helping your brother again, aren't you?" I asked gently. She looked surprised, then ashamed. "He's having a hard time," she said. "I can't just say no." I smiled softly. "You can. You just haven't learned how yet." She blinked, unsure if I was judging her. I told her a little about my own history, not all the details, just enough. "You can love people deeply," I said, "and still refuse to let them use you as a lifeline they never learned to swim from." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. Weeks later, I noticed she no longer answered her phone during work hours. She started staying late for design reviews, laughing more. Watching her grow steadier felt like witnessing a small redemption of my own. Around that time, I received another unexpected message from my cousin Rachel. We'd been exchanging occasional texts since her first outreach, but this one was different. "I'll be in town next week. Want to grab coffee?" We met at a small cafe near the art museum, the kind with brick walls and the smell of roasted beans that lingered in your hair. Rachel looked almost the same as she had at family gatherings years ago, though her expression carried a quiet strength I didn't remember. Conversation came easily, hesitant at first, then warm. She spoke about her job, her small apartment, and how she'd started setting boundaries with her own mother. "Watching you stand up to everyone made me realize I could too," she said. "It's not easy, but it's worth it." We talked for hours, finding a rhythm built not on obligation, but choice. When we finally said goodbye, she hugged me tightly, and for the first time in years, I felt what family could be without manipulation. Just two people trying to meet each other honestly. That evening, I walked home through the cooling air, the sky painted in lavender and gold. The city was loud, but somehow comforting, each sound blending into a single hum of life moving forward. I thought about all the years I'd wasted trying to earn love through sacrifice. It had taken losing everything familiar to understand that respect was never something you could buy, no matter the currency. By early spring, the house had fully transformed. The room where my family once gathered for that disastrous birthday now looked completely different. Soft sage walls, framed sketches, a wooden dining table I'd refinished myself. When sunlight streamed through the big windows, it glowed against the grain of the wood. I hosted friends there now, Elena, my team, sometimes Rachel. The laughter that filled the space sounded nothing like the brittle politeness I used to chase. One afternoon, I returned home to find a small package on my porch with no return label. Inside was a single sheet of paper in my father's handwriting. "Tommy's doing well in school. He still talks about you sometimes." Beneath it was a photo of him older now, smiling awkwardly at a science fair next to a model volcano. My throat tightened. I placed the picture on the refrigerator beside a postcard from Italy. The sight of them together, a past I couldn't undo and a future I was building, felt strangely right. That night, as the rain came down in gentle sheets, I stood in the kitchen and baked a cake. The same recipe as before, chocolate with raspberry filling. The scent filled the house warm and rich. I let it cool and cut a single slice, setting it on my grandmother's plate. I carried it to the patio wrapped in a blanket and watched the rain blur the city lights. The first bite was soft and sweet, tasting like closure. I thought about how pain changes shape over time. It doesn't disappear. It just settles differently, finding its quiet corners. Mine had become a kind of fuel, steady, slow burning, guiding me towards something that looked a lot like peace. A few days later, I received an email from a journalist who'd written about architecture and social impact. He'd read about the community center my firm designed and wanted to feature our work. When the article was published, it mentioned the project's focus on spaces that restore dignity through design. The phrase made me smile. That was exactly what I'd been trying to build, not just in buildings, but in myself. As spring deepened, I found myself looking forward to small things again. Farmers markets, early morning jogs, the way the light shifted across my office at different hours. I started gardening in the small patch behind my house, planting herbs and wildflowers. The first shoots of green reminded me that growth doesn't happen all at once. It happens quietly in the soil long before anyone sees it. One evening, Elena and I sat on my back patio, wine glasses in hand, watching the fireflies begin to spark in the yard. She turned to me and said, "You know you've come a long way." I laughed softly. "I feel like I've just begun." She smiled. "That's how you know it's real." Later, after she left, I lingered outside a little longer. The air was cool against my skin, carrying the faint scent of the lilacs I'd planted weeks before. The house behind me glowed in warm light. The windows open, music playing quietly from the kitchen. I realized then that I no longer dreaded the sound of my own heartbeat in an empty room. It struck me how peace doesn't arrive with fanfare. It seeps in like dusk, unnoticed, until everything around you softens. I closed my eyes and listened to the hum of the night. Somewhere far away, my family was living their lives. I wished them well, not out of longing, but out of release. Inside, the cake waited on the counter untouched, except for the single missing slice. I covered it, turned off the lights, and whispered a quiet thank you to the silence that once terrified me. It had become my truest companion. As I climbed the stairs, the house settled around me with a gentle creak, the kind old homes make when they're content. Tomorrow would bring new work, new people, new laughter, and maybe one day, new love. But for tonight, I let the calm wrap around me like a soft blanket. The air still warm, with the scent of chocolate, and rain, the promise of something whole waiting just beyond the morning. The house woke slowly that morning, stretching into the soft light that poured through the kitchen windows. The air smelled faintly of rain and coffee, a familiar comfort that settled in the walls like memory. I stood barefoot by the counter, watching the garden through the open door. The lilacs had grown wild around the fence line, their blossoms heavy with dew. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower started and then stopped, leaving behind a hum of quiet that felt like peace. It had been nearly a year since the night my family broke apart over a birthday cake. The sharpness of that memory had dulled its edges, rounded by time and distance. The floorboards I once scrubbed clean from spilled frosting now gleamed in the morning sun. I often thought of that night, but not with anger anymore. It had simply become a chapter, a moment that forced everything false to collapse so something real could finally begin. I carried my coffee to the back patio and sat at the small table I'd refinished myself. The wood was smooth under my hand, warm from the light. Birds moved between the branches, each one tracing small arcs of sound through the still air. A few feet away, the herbs I'd planted in early spring reached toward the sun, basil, thyme, mint, all thriving with the same quiet persistence I'd learned to practice myself. On the table lay an envelope postmarked from Arizona. I'd received it 2 days earlier and hadn't opened it until now. My father's handwriting still leaned slightly to the right, the way it always had. The letter inside was short. Your mother and I are doing well. She's started painting again. The doctor says the dry air helps her lungs. We think of you often and hope you're happy. Love, Dad. It wasn't an apology, and it didn't need to be. It was the first letter that didn't try to rewrite history or excuse it. Just a note from a man who had finally stopped pretending that love had to mean control. I read it twice, folded it carefully, and set it under my coffee mug to keep it from the breeze. Later that morning, I walked through the house with open windows, letting the air move freely from room to room. The walls carried new sounds, now music from the radio, laughter from evenings with friends, the quiet creak of floorboards under my own footsteps. The room that once held family tension had become a dining space filled with warmth. I'd hung a large canvas above the table, one my mother had painted years ago, but never displayed. When I found it in storage, I'd cleaned it and framed it. Sometimes, love doesn't need to return to be honored, it just needs to be seen for what it was. By afternoon, I was downtown, meeting David at the new library construction site. The structure rose clean and simple against the sky, its glass facade reflecting the clouds. He greeted me with a smile, safety helmet tucked under one arm. We walked the length of the atrium together, our footsteps echoing softly over the concrete. It's coming together beautifully, he said, glancing at the beams overhead. I nodded, tracing the lines of light that cut across the unfinished floor. I wanted it to feel like open air, I said. A place where people could breathe. He looked at me, his eyes warm. You built that long before this library. We stood there in comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need filling. Working with David had become one of the quiet joys of my life. There was no rush, no performance, just two people moving at a steady pace towards something kind. That evening after the meeting, I stopped by the cafe near the river where Rachel waited with two steaming cups of tea. The light through the window caught the faint copper in her hair as she waved me over. She told me about her new job and how she'd finally set a boundary with her mother that held firm. She didn't like it, Rachel said with a small smile, but she respected it. I smiled back. That's how it starts. We talked about Tommy too, news that had reached me through her side of the family. He'd won an award at his new school for a project on renewable energy. I felt something gentle inside me shift pride mingling with sadness. He'll be fine, I said quietly. Maybe better for it. When I returned home that night, I found a small package waiting on my porch. Inside was a single envelope with a crayon, drawing a stick figure woman beside a tall cake, both surrounded by red hearts. At the bottom, in shaky handwriting, it read, "Happy birthday, Aunt Dedra." There was no return address, but I didn't need one. The drawing said everything that words couldn't. I placed it on the fridge beside the old photo of Tommy at his science fair. The past and the present stood side by side, no longer at war. In the months that followed, my world continued to expand. My firm grew. Zoe flourished, designing her first solo project, a community playground she named The Haven. I watched her present it to the client with steady confidence, remembering how tentative her voice once was. After the meeting, she hugged me, whispering, "Thank you for believing in me." I smiled because I finally understood what belief really meant. It wasn't rescuing people. It was showing them the strength they already had. Elena and I kept our Saturday dinners, sometimes joined by Rachel or David. The evening stretched long, filled with stories and laughter that rose easily unforced. The house that had once felt haunted now carried life in every corner. Music footsteps, the clink of wine glasses against the oak table. Even the silence between moments felt full, like the pause after a deep exhale. By autumn, the air turned crisp and golden. The trees along my street burned with color scarlet amber rust. One morning, while trimming the garden, I found myself thinking about forgiveness. Not as a single act, but as a slow process that often happens without ceremony. The anger had dissolved long ago. Not because I excused what happened, but because I stopped waiting for them to see it the way I did. Peace had come not through closure, but through distance that finally felt safe. That November, I received one more letter from my father. "Tommy's doing well. He misses you. If you'd like to send him a card, here's our new address." I sat with that letter for a long while, then wrote a simple note. "Proud of you. Keep learning. Keep building." I enclosed a small photograph of the new library glowing at dusk. And beneath it, I wrote, "Every strong foundation starts with courage." When I sealed the envelope, I didn't feel the tremor of old fear. There was only calm and understanding that love at its truest doesn't require permission to exist. Winter arrived quietly. I traveled to Italy for a conference on sustainable design, spending my evenings wandering through cobblestone streets lit by soft lamps. One night, sitting on a balcony overlooking the Arno River, I realized I wasn't lonely. I was full of places, people, and moments that felt earned. The view before me shimmered with lights reflected on the water, each one distinct, yet part of something whole. When I returned home in December, the first snow had fallen. I unpacked slowly, made tea, and stood by the window watching the flakes drift under the streetlight. The city was hushed beneath the white, every sound softened. I thought about how far I'd come from that day a year ago, when everything I'd built for others had collapsed. The collapse had been necessary. It made room for a life that was finally mine. Before bed, I lit a candle on the dining table. Its small flame danced against the painted canvas above it, the one my mother had made years ago. The light shimmered across the brushstrokes, as if the painting itself were breathing. The scent of lilac lingered from the vase nearby, light but familiar. I closed my eyes and whispered a quiet thank you to the lessons, to the loss, to the peace that had followed. Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing the street in stillness. Inside, the warmth of the candlelight held steady, painting soft gold across the room. I watched the flame until it steadied into a single, unwavering glow. Some wounds don't fade because we forgive. They fade because we finally stop reopening them. Peace, I've learned, isn't given. It's something you decide to keep. If this story spoke to you, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever had to rebuild yourself after losing what you thought was family, share this story with someone who understands. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of quiet strength, second chances, and the kind of peace we make for ourselves.